All right, Secretary, so grateful you can make time for us. I want to talk about larger diplomatic goals, but I want to begin in the Middle East. The Israelis said they're not stopping until Hamas is gone. You've had a number of discussions, a number of trips there. What have you said to the Israelis? How much pressure are you putting on them right now to wrap things up? How close do you believe we are to the end of the conflict?
Well, you know, we said from the beginning, after the almost indescribable events of October 7th, is that, of course, Israel has a right, even an obligation, both to defend itself and also to try to make sure that October 7th never happens again. And we continue to support that. But it's also clear that how Israel does that matters, as we've said from the beginning, and maximizing every effort to protect civilians and to make sure that humanitarian assistance gets to those who need it is, from our perspective, critical. And at the same time, it's clear that this is going to have to move to a lower intensity phase. And this is very much part of our conversation with the Israelis.
So you've been telling the Israelis it's time to move to low intensity?
No, we were having conversations with them about moving to a lower intensity phase. The duration of the current phase, these fundamental decisions are for Israel to make. As their ally, their partner, we can give advice, we can give counsel, we can have very direct conversations about how we see things. They fundamentally have to make these decisions.
Do you believe that their goal, eliminating Hamas, is achievable?
The goal really is and needs to be focused on making sure that Hamas cannot repeat what it did on October 7th. And you have a group that, if left with the capacity and the stated intent to do that, and we've heard since October 7th, Hamas leaders say that if given the opportunity, they would do October 7th again and again and again. That's what they're intent on dealing with and making sure that, again, to the best of their ability, this doesn't happen again. But it's also critical that there be a path to a durable, sustainable peace, durable, sustainable security for Israel. And that can not only be achieved through military means, it has to be achieved as well through political means. From our perspective, we said this from well before October 7th, we see the fulfillment of political rights for the Palestinians, a Palestinian state, as critical to that. One of the things that's happened is, in a very perverse way, Hamas has captured the flag of Palestinian nationalism. And fundamentally, the ultimate way to recapture that flag is to stand for a better idea. And the better idea clearly is making sure that Palestinians have a future in which they can decide their own fate.
You've said that the Palestinian Authority should be leading Gaza. The Israelis, at least from what I've heard publicly, are opposed to that. Polls out of the West Bank and Gaza show that more than 90% want Abbas to resign. He's 88 years old. They're widely seen as corrupt. Are there better ideas? Are there alternatives there? Why prop up the Palestinian Authority?
So, first and foremost, it's imperative that Palestinian voices, Palestinian views are reflected, and ultimately the Palestinians have the ability to govern themselves. This is going to be a process. It'll be a process when the current conflict ends in Gaza, a process to get Gaza back on its feet, to help its people. It's going to be a process to make sure that governance combines both Gaza and the West Bank, and a process to see what kind of leadership emerges and how it emerges. I mean, ultimately, we stand for elections around the world. That's something that you'd also want to see at some point. But the most important thing is to make sure that Palestinians are governing themselves. And how they decide to do that, by which group, by which people, that fundamentally has to be their decision. But it's not something that will necessarily happen from one day to the next. You've got to get a process to get there.
I want to talk about hostages for a second. I know you've said you carry a card with you with the names of Americans who are held abroad. There's 8 Americans being held in Gaza right now, nearly 11 weeks in. Gaza's the size of Philadelphia. We have the most powerful military on earth. I've heard this from a number of members of our community saying, how is it that we have 8 Americans there, we give a lot of support to the Palestinians, and those Americans are still being held? Why can't the U.S. do more to get those people home?
We're on this every single day, and it's at the top of our list of priorities, which is to bring Americans home. We had, as you know, the humanitarian pause that resulted in the release of 110 hostages. We've had a few Americans who were released both as part of that pause and prior to that. And it's something that we would very much like to get back to. Unfortunately, Hamas decided to renege on its commitments which is why that pause broke down and the hostage releases stopped. We're working to see if we can get back to that. But it also underscores how incredibly complicated this is because, yes, it's a relatively small area, but as you know, Hamas has constructed an entire city underneath the existing cities with an extraordinarily elaborate tunnel network. These are things that are not easy to get at and very, very difficult to do anything effective to make sure that you can bring people out safely. The best way to do it is through a negotiation, and we've seen the results that we've gotten to date. We'd like to get back to that.
Personal question for you. You've discussed your faith. And actually it came up, I remember there was an early meeting with you standing alongside al-Sisi of Egypt, where he mentioned, you're Jewish, and he had something to say about that. I was curious, your identity in watching the events of October 7th, watching the rise of anti-Semitism globally, how that's impacted you personally, and how your identity impacts your diplomacy.
Well, I think we all bring our identity, our backgrounds to the table in whatever we're doing, and certainly I bring mine, and I bring mine also as the stepson of a Holocaust survivor, as the grandson of someone who fled pogroms in what's now Ukraine and came to the United States to remake his life here. You can't help but bring that to the table. And when you see something like October 7th that brings to mind the very kinds of atrocities that your family had been subjected to in previous generations, you can't help but think of that. But having said that, I'm an American. I have the immense privilege of being the Secretary of State in this moment, representing our country, representing all Americans, and that's where I start. So I'm trying to make sure on behalf of the President that as we're engaged around the world, we're doing so in a way that advances American interests, American values. That's what this is about.
This is a question that came up a lot, because we wake up in the morning and you've already been to 3 world capitals. The exhaustion factor being Secretary of State. What is the most challenging part? What is the secret to doing this job, Secretary?
The secret is having an incredible team of people working with you. For every hour that I work, for every hour that I'm awake, they're working, they're awake 2 or 3 hours. And that's really the secret sauce. We just have an amazing group of people who are doing this every single day, every single night. And that's what keeps me going, because I know what they're putting into this. I want to make sure I'm doing the same thing.
I was expecting to hear coffee.
Well, that too.
Okay.
A little bit of caffeine helps.
In regards to Iran, there's some criticism that the U.S. has not been strong enough in fighting back. More than 100 attacks across the region. BP, others now saying they're going to avoid the Red Sea in regards to the Houthis. Why hasn't the U.S. been tougher? You even saw former CIA Director Leon Panetta say, we need to be less selective. We need to be much more aggressive. The Iranians are sensing weakness. What's your reaction to that?
Well, first, of course, we have taken action. We've taken action against Iranian-backed militia in both Iraq and in Syria. We have put together now a maritime task force to deal with the threat that the Houthis pose to maritime shipping. We've got 40 countries, I think, just today, putting out a statement in opposition to what the Houthis are doing, and also making commitments to work on this maritime task force. But one of the things we said from the outset is, even as we and the world are intensely focused on Gaza, we also want to try to make sure that this conflict doesn't spread, that it doesn't go to more places, that it doesn't go to Lebanon and Israel's border with Lebanon, that it doesn't go to the West Bank, that it doesn't go to the broader region. And so making sure that the actions that we're taking are very deliberate, very focused on deterring the conflict from spreading, not provoking a conflict to grow wider, that's something that we have to factor in as well. But we have taken resolute action when our people have been endangered. We've made very clear that we'll continue to do that. We've taken action against many Iranian individuals, Iranian entities, as well as, I said, the militia that are beholden to them that are operating in Iraq and Syria. But we want to make sure, in the first instance, that our people are protected. That's job number one. And second, that this doesn't spread. And so you have to be very deliberate about what you're doing.
Your role is to promote U.S. image abroad. One of the most popular apps abroad, internationally and here domestically, is TikTok. I was struck by your congressional testimony earlier this year. You said TikTok should be ended one way or another. I'm curious why you're concerned about TikTok and what you mean by ended one way or another.
Well, we have a real challenge with TikTok, and the fact that unfortunately we see in China the use and abuse of technology for reasons well beyond what that technology is designed for. In other words, in one way or another, to get information that's used by the state, that's used by the military, and that potentially could undermine our security. So we've had real concerns about that, real concerns about the relationship between TikTok and the Chinese government, the Chinese state, the Chinese military, and that's something we have to guard against. On the other hand, look, I recognize that so many people are on that platform, are getting information on that platform, are having conversations through that platform, that it does pose a real question and a real challenge in figuring out how we can appropriately engage while dealing with some of the real concerns that we have about security. So there are a number of ideas that are out there about how to square that circle. It's something that we're looking at and working on.
So ended one way or another?
Again, it really is a question of making sure that the security concerns that we have about the possible misuse or abuse of the platform that in ways that could undermine our security as a country are addressed.
Well, end here, big picture. You gave an address at Hopkins earlier this year. You talked about how people around the world are losing faith in the international economic order. I've seen some analyses done that basically the world now is split 50-50, authoritarian regimes, democracies. We were sort of peak democracies about 10 years ago, and that's sort of fallen. Wondering, countries aren't looking to China as a model here. Is that a failure of American foreign policy? Is that just good policy by the Chinese? How much does that concern you, and how are you trying to change that momentum?
Well, first, I don't think that the countries are necessarily looking toward China. On the contrary, what we've seen, especially over the last 2 or 3 years, is a much greater convergence between us and many countries in Europe and many countries in Asia on how to approach some of the challenges that China poses. We're much closer than we've ever been. Second, I think you see countries around the world that have done business with China that have second thoughts about taking loans and taking investment from China that turns into massive debt loads on those countries, concerns about the importation of Chinese workers to build the various infrastructure projects that China's engaged in, concern about worker standards, environmental standards, corruption, and so we see a lot of that. On the other hand, you also see countries that are laboring mightily under a few things. They're laboring mightily under debt burdens that we have to help them get out from under. They're also laboring under the difficulty of getting access to capital to do the critical things that their people need and want them to do, including addressing some of the challenges of climate change, dealing with food security, building infrastructure, making sure that they have a sound energy future. So we are spending a lot of time and a lot of effort in trying to reform the international financial system so that countries that need it can have greater access to capital, so that they can get out from under debt, so that they can find a means of actually addressing what their people want. We've spent a lot of time ourselves in trying to work on things like food insecurity. That's a challenge for countries around the world. We are, by orders of magnitude, the largest donor to the World Food Program. We provide about 50% of its budget. To cite some other examples, China and Russia provide less than 1% of its budget. We have major initiatives to try to tackle some of the things that people are feeling and experiencing in their own lives, including the need for better infrastructure, including the need for building climate resilience, including the need for dealing with food insecurity.
So you feel we're effectively competing with...
Here's what it comes down to.
Yeah.
We're not asking people to choose. We're trying to offer a better choice. They have to decide. We're not making anyone decide. But if we're offering what we think is a better option, that better addresses their needs and addresses it in a way that is also responsive to some of the concerns they have, I think I know the choice they'll make.
Secretary, thank you for joining us today.
Great to be with you.